Princess Elizabeth and the Prince Philip, Duke of Edinburgh, enjoying a walk during their honeymoon at Broadlands, Romsey, Hampshire, the 24th of November 1947. Credit: Getty He overcame family tragedy and personal difficulty to become a war hero, and also won the heart of the future Queen. Dynamic, driven, and prone to explosions of both ardor and anger, he was never cut out by temperament for a secondary role, but somehow Prince Philip transformed himself. Now, as the longest-serving royal consort in British history approaches 90, the final part of our exclusive extract from Philip Eads' new book, Young Prince Philip, His Turbulent Early Life, tells how he wooed a young Elizabeth, and the nation, too. The Duke of Edinburgh retires, a life of public service in pictures. After the war was over, Prince Philip remained in the Far East with his destroyer Whelp to collect and bring home prisoners of war, arriving back in Portsmouth on the 17th of January 1946. A series of unexciting home postings had left him restless and disillusioned after the buzz of action. In a letter to Queen Elizabeth, he admitted he was still not accustomed to the idea of peace, rather fed up with everything and feeling that there was not much to look forward to, and rather grudgingly accepting the idea of going on in the peacetime Navy. The Duke of Edinburgh, as a serving officer in the Royal Navy 1946. Credit: PA. His home postings did at least allow for more frequent trips to London, and Marion Crawford, Princess Elizabeth's governess, described seeing Philip's black-green upholstered MG sports car roaring into the forecourt of Buckingham Palace and the prince getting out hatless and always in a hurry to see Lilibet. According to Crawford, Elizabeth began to take more trouble with her appearance and to play the tune People Will Say We're in Love from the musical Oklahoma. In London, Philip would stay either with his grandmother, Princess Victoria, at Kensington Palace or on a camp bed at the home of his uncle, Dickie Mountbatten. In visitors' books at the time, he declared himself of no fixed abode. The Mountbatten's butler, Jen Dean, later Philip's valet, was struck by the fact that the prince's civilian wardrobe was scantier than that of many a bank clerk, and that often all he brought with him was a razor. When he had gone to bed, Dean would wash and iron his shirt and darn his socks. He was very easy to look after and never asked for things like that to be done for him, but I liked him so much that I did it anyway. Dean noticed that when he unpacked Philip's weekend bag, there was always a photograph of Princess Elizabeth in a battered leather frame. Prince Philip, Duke of Edinburgh, as a young man, circa 1935. Credit: Getty. On the 29th of May 1946, Philip was photographed next to Elizabeth at the wedding of her new lady-in-waiting, but was described in the press as a figure largely unknown to the British public. They tried not to be seen together and, if they were in the same party, took the precaution of not dancing with each other. But behind the scenes, the courtship was entering a new and bolder phase. Profile: Prince Philip, Duke of Edinburgh. In June 1946, Philip wrote to the Queen apologizing for the monumental cheek of having invited himself to the palace. Yet however contrite I feel, he wrote, there is always a small voice that keeps saying nothing ventured, nothing gained. Well, did I venture, and I gained a wonderful time. Late that summer, the Queen asked him to Balmoral for 3 weeks to shoot grouse and stock. It was probably during this holiday that he proposed. The Queen and Prince Philip through the ages at last, he wrote to the Queen, life seemed to have a purpose. To have been spared in the war and seen victory, to have been given the chance to rest and to readjust myself, to have fallen in love completely and unreservedly, makes all one's personal and even the world's troubles seem small and petty. The king agreed in principle to let the couple marry, but wanted them to wait until Elizabeth was 21. Mabel Airlie, lady-in-waiting to Queen Mary, attributed the king's foot-dragging to his secret dread of losing his constant companion in shooting, walking, riding, in fact everything. But he was also aware of senior courtiers' opposition to the match. Certain guests at Balmoral reportedly found Philip rather unpolished, by which they seemed to mean that he had no +4s and blithely went shooting in his flannel trousers with a borrowed gun. An indiscreet footman let on that his solitary naval valise contained no spare shoes, pajamas or slippers, and that his only walking shoes had to be taken to the local cobbler to be repaired. Prince Philip, Duke of Edinburgh, to step down from royal duties. Credit: Keystone. More hostility was engendered because he had not been to the right school. Virtually every courtier was an old Etonian. Gordonston, where Philip completed his education, was seen as suspiciously German and dangerously progressive. The jibe that he was no gentleman stemmed from what his opponents perceived to be Philip's rude and overbearing manner. The self-reliance bred in him by his difficult upbringing could come across as cockiness, and he could appear arrogant when brushing aside obstacles to get things done. However, his forthrightness and independence were precisely the traits that had won Elizabeth's heart, accustomed as she had been all her life to fawning deference. A guest at Balmoral noted how undemonstrative Philip was but concluded, given the sort of experience He'd had as a child, you probably would shut yourself away a bit to avoid being hurt. Affection is not his natural currency. To begin with, the King and Queen had misgivings about the match. According to Harold Nick Olson, they felt he was rough, ill-mannered, uneducated and would probably not be faithful. But the more they got to know him, the more they liked him, especially George VI, who appreciated his forthright manner, joshing humor and love of the outdoors. Initially, the Queen seems to have found the briskness of her prospective son-in-law slightly unappealing. She had produced a cricket 11 of possibles, remembered Sir Edward Ford, and it's hard to know whom she would have sent in first, but it certainly wouldn't have been Philip. Happy family. The 28th of September 1952, Queen Elizabeth with her husband Prince Philip, Duke of Edinburgh, and her children, Charles and Anne, at Balmoral Castle in Scotland. Credit Getty. Though Philip's close links to Germany were largely shared by the whole of the royal family, Jouk Colville, the diplomat who became Elizabeth's official private secretary, reported dark mutterings about his Teutonic strain. Another ex-courtier later explained, the kind of people who didn't like Prince Philip were the kind of people who didn't like Mountbatten. It was all bound up in a single word, German. The association with his glittering yet controversial uncle was always going to be double-edged. Close as Mountbatten was to George VI, he was also a transparent intriguer, an elephant trampling down the jungle rather than a snake in the grass, and pushy with it. Some of the old courtiers suspected that he planned to use Philip as a Trojan horse to infiltrate the monarchy, enabling him to set about reforming the institution along lines that he saw fit. Philip was often uncomfortable about the blatant orchestration of his courtship. "Please, I beg of you," he wrote to Dickie, "not too much advice in an affair of the heart, or I shall be forced to do the wooing by proxy." As a preliminary to the almost certain engagement, Mountbatten had fought a hard campaign for Philip's naturalization as a British citizen. The prince elected to become a commoner and relinquished his right of succession to the Greek throne, and was euphoric when Philip, less warmly, took the name Mountbatten. Even so, Philip was well aware that things could still go wrong, especially if his uncle meddled too conspicuously in his marriage plans. "I am not being rude," he wrote to Dickie, "but it is apparent that you like the idea of being general manager of this little show, and I am rather afraid that she, the princess, might not take to the idea as docilely as I do." Princess Elizabeth and Lieutenant Philip Mountbatten pose for their first engagement pictures at Buckingham Palace, the 1st of July 1947. Credit PA. Their engagement was announced on the 9th of July 1947. At their first public appearance, at a garden party at Buckingham Palace, Lady Airlie thought Elizabeth looked flushed and radiant with happiness while Philip seemed shy. She liked the fact that he was wearing his shabby uniform with the usual after-the-war look and had not bought a new one to make an impression. "Observing him, I thought that he had far more character than most people would imagine." In the years after their marriage, Philip had hoped to forge ahead towards high command in the Navy and to enjoy a relatively carefree life ashore. But the premature of his father-in-law in 1952 precluded all this. He seemed to spend the first few months of his wife's reign in profoundly low spirits. Queen Elizabeth II and the Duke of Edinburgh leaving Westminster Abbey after their wedding ceremony, the 20th of November 1947. Credit PA. Until that time he'd been head of the family. "I suppose I naturally filled the principal role," he recalled. "People used to come to me and ask me what to do." In 1952 the whole thing changed, very considerably. He was 31. It was too soon for a vigorous and headstrong young man to slip happily into walking the yard behind his wife at public functions. While Elizabeth mourned her father, Philip mourned the end of his free life, and the year ahead was to be a bruising one as he struggled to find a new sense of purpose. "There were plenty of people telling me what not to do," he recalled. "I had to try to support the Queen as best I could without getting in the way. The difficulty was to find things that might be useful." He determined to act as Elizabeth's eyes and ears, getting around the country, visiting factories and coal mines, broadening her experience by proxy and keeping her informed about public opinion. But at every turn, there seemed to be an attempt to undermine him. He felt deeply wounded by a decision that the family name of Windsor should be retained and his children would therefore not bear his surname. They were obliged to move from Clarence House to Buckingham Palace, where he found he was no longer master of his own house. His modernizing instincts did not go down well with some of the starchier courtiers, though a veteran of 3 reigns later admitted that the questions Philip asked were exactly those which lots of us had wanted to ask for years. Edward Ford, a young courtier, thought his arrival was like a breath of fresh air. Philip broke new ground by carrying his own luggage and refusing to ring a bell to order food. When electric frying pans came onto the market, he took to cooking his own eggs and bacon in their private dining room, until Elizabeth complained that the smell lingered until lunchtime. At a glance, current line of succession to the British throne. Gradually and effectively, he overcame disappointment at the premature loss of his professional career. On the 4th of May 1953, a month before the coronation, he received his wings and became a highly skilled pilot. Flying took his mind off the drawbacks of his life as consort. His reputation soared with a general public who appreciated his ability to connect with the man in the street and to talk bluff common sense to factory workers. Dynamic, driven, outspoken and prone to explosions of both ardor and anger, he was never cut out by temperament for a secondary role. It went against the grain of his overtly masculine character. Yet that is what he ultimately chose for himself, and he was the first of the senior peers to pay homage to his wife after her crowning. I, Philip, Duke of Edinburgh, do become your liege man of life and limb of earthly worship. It put the seal on the sacrifice he had made of his freedom. Britain's Queen Elizabeth leaving the Houses of Parliament following the annual state opening of Parliament in London, 2009. Credit, Reuters. Elizabeth's transformation from what Time magazine in 1957 called his slightly frumpy and occasionally frosty bride to a radiantly warm young woman, owed much to the strength and stability of the marriage to Philip. He had a very wholesome effect on her, says one diplomat. She had a protective shell around her and he brought her out of it. He helped to make her what she's become. Young Prince Philip, His Turbulent Early Life by Philip Ede, Harper Press. RRP £25 is available from Telegraph Books at £23, £1 and 25 pence pp. Call 0844-871-1516 or visit books.telegraph.co.uk. The Duke of Edinburgh's schedule.